Good afternoon. It's good to see so many of you on this anniversary of Bastille Day. I promise that no heads will roll during the course of this event. I'm Tom Schwartz, director of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Museum. And we owe a great debt of gratitude to archivist Matt Schaefer, who organized this event. Matt's in the back. And to Becky Allgood and the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Association for sponsoring today's author talk. And also Charlie Becker, I believe, is here as well. Charlie and Becky, will you kind of raise your hand? Thank you. In 1975, the Library Association assumed the task of providing scholars and public alike with a comprehensive biography of our 31st president, Herbert Hoover. 4 volumes have been issued chronicling Mr. Hoover's life from birth through his years as Secretary of Commerce. Professor Glen Jeansonne has provided a desperately needed comprehensive study of Hoover's presidency that is both balanced, thoughtful, and thought-provoking. Copies of Professor Jeansonne's book will be available for purchase following the talk, where he will be available for further discussion, and autographed copies of Herbert Hoover, Fighting Quaker, 1928 to 1933. The book is being offered at a 20% discount just for today. And because this will be a signed limited edition, we will have a calligrapher available to put your name and number in each copy sold. It is indeed a great pleasure to introduce Glen Jeansonne. He was born in New Orleans and grew up in New Roads, Louisiana. A graduate of the University of Louisiana Lafayette, Jeansonne received a PhD in history from Florida State University. His early writings focused on Louisiana's political figures such as Leander Perez, Huey P. Long, and Long's associate Gerald L.K. Smith. His interests have also led Jeansonne to explore broader cultural issues of the period with studies such as Woman of the Far Right, A Time of Paradox, America Since 1890, and Elvis Presley, Reluctant Rebel. A prodigious writer, Jeansonne has 14 books, nearly 60 articles, and more than 150 review essays and other writings to his credit. He's the recipient of numerous awards, fellowships, and honors. And while his writing achievements are impressive by any measure, Jeansonne is most proud of his 35 years in the classroom, teaching and mentoring the next generation of teachers and scholars. Having supervised 40 graduate theses, Jeansonne leaves a large living legacy of historical researchers. Originally, Jeansonne was interested in writing a full-scale biography of Herbert Hoover, a project he still pursues. He agreed to write the volume on Hoover's presidency for the Library Association and spent 3 years of intensive work on the volume, living in West Branch for a time above the famed Herb and Lou's Pizza Parlor. Those of you who have not met Professor Jeansonne or are familiar with his writings are in for a treat. His prose contains unexpected turns of whimsy and humor. He opines, if we are to condemn men for shyness, Hoover might merit the death penalty. And when describing Black Tuesday stock, shares were dumped like Las Vegas brides. Ultimately, Jeansonne provides an empathetic account of Hoover's tireless efforts to keep the American economy afloat during its darkest days. As Hoover stated in 1931, many thinkers are beginning to recognize the fact that the decrease in business activity during certain periods is largely the result of fear. As Hoover navigated the country through these fearful times, Jeansonne reminds us that Hoover wanted to change politics. He did not want it to change him. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Glen Jeansonne.
Thank you, Tom. It's very nice to be here today, and I appreciate the large crowd that's come out. I want to thank a few people. I actually, when I was planning on writing the full-scale biography, spent 18 consecutive months in West Branch, as Tom said, living above Herb and Lou's pizza, sandwich shop, and bar. And it was probably the only place in the country that people would buy me drinks to tell them Hoover stories. I find this book to give me a sense of purpose that no previous book had done, and the one I'm working on now in his complete life, I find that even more compelling. I think, though, that each of my books was necessary to do the next one, and all of them were necessary to do this one. I want to thank Tom Schwartz and Becky Allgood for inviting me here, the Hoover Library Association for inviting me to write this presidential biography, and I'd like to thank Matt Schaefer for planning it. And living here was a wonderful experience. I'm a small town boy from Louisiana. I like small towns. I wanted to live in West Branch and soak up some of the atmosphere of where Hoover himself was born and spent his first 9 years. And I think that I couldn't have done the book the way I did it without doing that. I met many wonderful people. I came to the library every day it was open during the period I was here, and it was open every day except federal holidays. And on Christmas Eve one year, the director, Tim Walsh, had given the whole staff off, and he was the only one left. And it was just me and Tim in the reading room. And Tim was sitting at the desk, just watching me and waiting for Santa Claus. And I told him, I said, you know, Tim, if it weren't for me being here, you could shut down the whole library and go home. And Tim said, yeah, Glenn, but you're doing the work of the Lord. So this staff is very dedicated. And I especially owe another debt of gratitude to Matt Schaefer. And as I believe all things are connected, there's some very strange things that may seem coincidences but turn out not to be. And that was true in Herbert Hoover's life as well. Just for example, Matt Schaefer was really my chief helper in the reading room while I was researching this. In 1985, while a graduate student at the University of Michigan, was my teaching assistant in a survey course that I taught there. That was the only year I taught at the University of Michigan. And Matt was a PhD student, and I was researching the papers of Gerald L.K. Smith there. I owe a great debt of gratitude to Matt as well. I also became a fan of the West Branch Bears this year. A great small-town football dynasty. It was a very pleasant surprise, and I think the best coach team at that level that I've ever seen. I've just completed a series of 30 radio interviews trying to promote this book. And now it's a great pleasure to come back and speak before the home team. In the 21st century, the only thing that most Americans remember about Herbert Hoover is that he failed to end the Great Depression. Many Americans even blame him for starting it, deliberately or through incompetence, and subsequently doing nothing to alleviate it. He consistently ranks near the bottom of presidential polls. However, many historians who have studied Hoover carefully are more positive. Still, attempting to resurrect Hoover's reputation from the dustbins of neglect and distortion is a task comparable to that of a Samson, Atlas, or Sisyphus. I feel more like Sisyphus. Hoover is not only a misunderstood president, he's also a neglected one. The last presidential biography was written in 1985. Thus, the opportunity to write a presidential study, which I hope to expand into a full life biography, is a great opportunity. Perhaps more original things remain to be said about Hoover than about any but our most recent presidents. And a mother lode of primary documents exist here at the Hoover Library. Though unfair and superficial, Hoover's low ranking in the polls is easy to explain. Presidents are usually blamed for everything bad that happens on their watch and given credit for everything good that happens, which oversimplifies cause and effect. For example, every president considered a great president is credited with winning a war. Yet in reality, no president wins wars by himself any more than any president starts or ends a depression by himself. Almost all presidents who serve under the shadow of hard times are blamed for them and not reelected. Probably no one elected in 1928 could have been reelected in 1932. If Satan had run on the Democratic ticket in 1932, Satan would have won. Some Republicans still think that Satan actually did. Put another way, if Jesus Christ had run on the Republican ticket, Jesus would have finished second. For the general public, symbols are more graphic and digestible than complex realities. It's easier to explain events, especially tragic ones, in terms of human scapegoats. The symbol sticks in memory and becomes a metaphor for the event, which is etched in stone. Hoover and depression might as well be synonyms in Roget's Thesaurus. He is an indelibly linked in the public mind to the Great Depression as Isaac Newton is with the law of gravity. Yet blaming the Depression on Hoover is no more logical than blaming the law of gravity on the apocryphal apple that fell on Newton's head. Sometimes people seek scapegoats for partisan reasons. In politics, Hoover has become a foil for Franklin D. Roosevelt, used to embellish Roosevelt's reputation. The myth exists that Hoover ruined the country and then that the New Deal stepped in to save it. Yet presidents are not omnipotent. The Depression did end on Roosevelt's watch, but Roosevelt did not end the Depression. Just as the Depression began on Hoover's watch, yet Hoover did not instigate the Depression. To the contrary, Hoover did everything in his power to avert it. He was in the vanguard of Jeremiah's, prophetic yet despised. Both Hoover and Roosevelt did their best to mitigate the Depression, and the United States did not topple into the abyss of totalitarianism as did much of the world. The New Deal, however, might have continued indefinitely without ending the Depression. Unemployment was still 19% in 1938. The United States, under the New Deal, was actually one of the last major nations to emerge from the Depression. The idea also exists that enormous government spending for World War II ended the Depression. Yet government spending by itself is incapable of permanently ending a depression. The economy is not literally a battery that can be jump-started or a pump that can be primed. These are only metaphors. All government jobs are temporary. They end when the project ends or when the appropriation expires. That is true of all the jobs created by the New Deal and also of those created by World War II. In fact, the New Deal barely made a dent in ending the Depression, and World War II did so only indirectly. The war did have an impact on the Depression, but it was not the usually suspected one of simply pumping up the economy with dollars. First, the war changed the mood of the nation by breaking the psychology of fear. People no longer felt guilty for spending or too fearful to invest. Government regulations were relaxed in order to encourage production. Secondly, there were 14 years of pent-up consumer demand. Not only the 4 years of the war, during which there were rationing and shortages, but the entire decade from 1930 to 1940, the period of the Great Depression. Psychologically, and because of need, dollars were liberated to be spent. Perhaps most importantly, vast markets abroad opened up for Americans that had simply not been there before. The United States economy and industry was relatively sheltered, but the war had devastated the economic infrastructure of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and numerous smaller nations, especially in Europe. The colonial empires that had nourished the economic appetites of the major European powers and Japan with cheap raw materials were beginning to collapse. The major powers, especially those on whose soil the war had been fought, needed American industrial goods, American agricultural products, American capital, American technology, and American expertise. In an economic sense, and to some degree a military sense, America was in the driver's seat as never before or ever since. Still, if neither Hoover nor Roosevelt ended the Depression, their exertions were not insignificant. While Roosevelt's work is generally recognized, Hoover is frequently caricatured as a miserly misanthrope who cackled with his millionaire friends while hungry people huddled in cardboard shacks sardonically nicknamed Hoovervilles. Some of my students occasionally ask me what state Hooverville is in. I don't tell them Iowa. I tell them it is in a state of mind. The exertions of Hoover to lift the nation from the trough of its deepest and longest economic catastrophe are not widely appreciated. For someone frequently dismissed as an inept politician, he extracted a package of useful legislation from a divided Congress in which even his own party was factionalized. Hoover was realistic about the Depression. Addressing the psychological paralysis, he utilized radio more than any predecessor and almost as frequently as his successor, although he was no mindless Pollyanna, but a realist. Under his leadership, America fared better economically than most of the Western world. The first Quaker president, the firstborn west of the Mississippi, and the first civilian never previously elected to office, he was a quintessential problem solver. However, he considered the idea that the federal government, or more specifically the federal treasury, held the solution to all problems, simplistically utopian. He clearly understood that there was no quack cure for a sick economy. He lacked the magic of Harry Houdini, but even Houdini produced not magic, but the illusion of magic. Both quick and deep, probably among the top 10 of all presidents in intelligence, he understood people, their problems, and their impatience. Underlying the philosophy of American individualism was equality of opportunity undergirded by a sound public education. He wanted America to be a meritocracy with a heart. To Hoover, money was neither the root of all evil nor the solution to all problems. It was not necessarily a recipe for happiness. He knew there had been indigent saints and miserable millionaires. Government spending might mitigate depressions, but could not end them. The government could only transfer wealth. It could not create it. Short-term deficit spending was necessary, and Hoover supported it in times of wars and depression. But if the government entered a permanent treadmill of spending to ensure prosperity, somebody, someday, would have to pay the piper. Many of Hoover's warnings were unpopular, yet prophetic. For example, he believed that bureaucracies, once created, were self-perpetuating, the closest thing on earth to eternal life. He disliked big government, big business, a big millionaire, a big military, and big fortunes. He sympathized neither with greed nor with people helping themselves to other people's money indiscriminately. He felt that the welfare state could become addictive. In many respects, he was not behind his times, but ahead of them. Neither was Hoover an inert reactionary. He was the first president to pit the government against the economic cycle, a progressive in the lineage of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. He had served in Wilson's administration and supported ratification of the Versailles Treaty. Yet, unlike Roosevelt, the Rough Rider, he led by example grounded in moral conviction rather than by inflammatory oratory. He succeeded in pushing emergency legislation through a divided Congress because he did not care who received the credit. Modest, thrifty, yet a philanthropist, he refused to trade patronage for votes, to lie to the public in order to embellish his record, and he dodged the limelight. He wanted to be president not to cement himself in office, but because he believed he could do the most good by serving at the highest level. If he had known of the tragic challenges his nation would face, he nonetheless would have wanted the job, perhaps even more so. Hoover's legislative cupboard was hardly bare. He wrenched out of a divided Congress, in which he never had a working majority in both houses, and in which his own party was factionalized, the most integrated, sophisticated, constructive program of any president up to his time, except perhaps for Woodrow Wilson's first term. He worked as well with a bipartisan Congress during election year 1932 as any president in history during hard times. He had addressed agriculture, a struggling sector ever since the First World War, by pushing through Congress the Farm Marketing Act, creating a farm board to rationalize farming like other businesses and to encourage cooperative purchasing and marketing. However, overproduction remained intractable. Hoover could not persuade farmers that they could earn more by planting less. In the 72nd Congress, with the nation mired in the muck of the Depression, he shepherded through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, designed to lubricate the economy with credit in order to save banks and businesses from foreclosure, from failure. Yet banks hoarded their liquid assets rather than loan them, and business was reluctant to borrow to invest in expansion during uncertain times. The Glass-Steagall Act prevented the hoarding or fleeing of bullion and currency to safe havens abroad, keeping more money in circulation, and stabilized international trade. Hoover's public works program was more expansive than any up to that time. These included the Hoover Dam, waterways, highways, river and harbor improvements, and numerous buildings in Washington, D.C. still in use today. His administration planned many projects completed under the New Deal, including the San Francisco Bay Bridge, the Los Angeles Aqueduct, and the Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River. And he negotiated a treaty to construct the St. Lawrence Seaway, which Congress refused to ratify. The greatest conservationist president since Theodore Roosevelt, he expanded national parks and forests and built roads and paths within them, providing local employment. He preserved labor peace, increased credit for farmers and potential homebuyers, and worked to stimulate private construction of homes and businesses. He kept wages at existing levels as long as possible. Tolerance was the cornerstone of his Quaker philosophy. Hoover reformed prisons, backed women's suffrage and their political participation, and won the black vote not only in 1928, but in 1932. During hard times, he increased appropriations for the Indian Bureau, the Women's Bureau, and for Howard University, a black university in Washington. Hoover had strong support among women because he considered the family the glue of society. He supported a constitutional amendment to outlaw child labor. Hoover was not class conscious. He considered neither the rich nor the poor inherently predatory. The Quaker never engaged in negative campaigning. He believed in regulation, but not over-regulation, and he filed more anti-monopoly suits than any previous president. He did not believe the strong should be permitted to crush the weak. Hoover certainly was not a laissez-faire president. The old guard of his own party did not want him to be nominated because they considered him too independent. The radicals of his party did not want him either because he rejected reckless experimentation. Eminent Hoover historian George Nash has termed Hoover a political orphan, too progressive for the conservatives and too conservative for the radicals. One of his arch-enemies during the early New Deal, Raymond Moley, the head of FDR's Brain Trust, termed Hoover the greatest Republican of his generation. Upon becoming president, before the Depression undermined the foundations of Western civilization, Hoover had planned to implement his Quaker ideals by making world peace his priority. Despite the Depression, his accomplishments in that area are impressive. He initiated the Good Neighbor policy with Latin America, often attributed to FDR, and inspired the London Naval Disarmament Conference of 1930, the Intergovernmental Debt Moratorium of 1931, and the Stimson Doctrine of 1932. He held summit conferences in the United States with Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald of Britain, Premier Daladier of France, and Foreign Minister Dino Grandi of Italy. Hoover dominated world statesmanship during his term and changed the dynamics of international diplomacy. Previously, heads of state had exchanged letters through ambassadors. Now they negotiated face-to-face. An internationalist who had supported ratification of the Versailles Treaty, under Hoover, the United States was more involved in international affairs during peacetime than under any previous president. Although Hoover's tangible accomplishments are substantial, his reputation rests not solely on what he did, but on who he was. A great man, if not a great president, he was also a good man. He was unusually pure of heart, intellectually and fiscally honest, perhaps our most unselfish president in the modern age. He never let his ego overpower his principles or told a self-serving lie. No modern president, with the possible caveat of Dwight D. Eisenhower, contributed more before entering the White House, and none made comparable contributions as an ex-president. Jimmy Carter comes close as an ex-president, yet Carter has never had the clout in the Democratic Party that Hoover had in the Republican Party. His presidency, bookended by an active career in and out of politics, Hoover led a fascinating life that would be worth writing about even if he had never become president. Hoover's adult life bridged the gay 90s and the populist movement, the progressive era, the roaring 20s, the Great Depression, the First and Second World Wars, the Atomic Age, and the Cold War. When he was born, his father was shoeing horseshoes in West Branch, Iowa. When he died, half a continent away in New York City, men were planning a voyage of discovery that would sail upon the sea of tranquility. Indeed, if one traces the world figures he knew, they seem to include nearly every major world figure in his lifetime, from David Starr Jordan, Jan Paderewski, and Andrew Carnegie, all of whom he met as a mere Stanford student, to Winston Churchill, Vladimir Lenin, at least by correspondence, Woodrow Wilson, John Maynard Keynes, Adolf Hitler, Douglas MacArthur, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Chiang Kai-shek, and Mahatma Gandhi. The list appears endless. It includes women, too. Mary Pickford, Amelia Earhart, and Eleanor Roosevelt. Hoover enjoyed the company of the aviator Charles Lindbergh, the auto magnate Henry Ford, the inventor Thomas Jefferson, and scores of prominent journalists, statesmen, engineers, and scientists. He knew every president, from Theodore Roosevelt to Lyndon Baines Johnson. Hoover was a principled pragmatist who liked to describe himself as a practical idealist. John Kennedy borrowed from him the aphorism that ideals without illusions are good. Ideals with illusions are no good. Hoover loved people and he loved work, in that order. Few people who knew him intimately were unaffected by his dedication to humanitarianism and his low-voltage magnetism. He appealed to spiritual values, common sense, and self-interest. Though he did not entirely succeed at everything he did, it was not due to lack of effort. On Judgment Day, no one will ever say Herbert Hoover did not try. His character could be summed up in a single word: unselfish. He was unpretentious and unaffected by fame, high office, honors, or wealth. He did not lust for power, nor did he turn politics to his own end. He knew what many men in public life fail to realize, that the only kind of morality that really counts is when no one is looking. The test of a nation occurs not when everything is humming well. The test of a football team is not when it wins the big game, but when it loses the big game. His presidency might have been a disappointment, but it was not the unmitigated disaster many believe. If one surveys world leaders who were incumbents at the time the Depression began, it would be difficult to find many, if any, who served their country better during the first act of a tragedy that could have been written by Sophocles. One also searches in vain for a candidate electable in 1928 who was better equipped to handle the tribulations of the early Great Depression. Neither Hoover nor Franklin D. Roosevelt solved the Great Depression during a single term, nor did any other world leader of their time. Yet America's democratic system remained intact. Hoover appointed men of quality to office without regard for political considerations, making merit, not political influence, the criterion for appointments. Of the top 100 men in his administration, some died, some retired, some were promoted, but none was fired for incompetence or corruption. Although later generations have insisted that he should have done more, in 1932, his most severe and conspicuous critics, including Franklin D. Roosevelt, complained not that he was doing too little too late, but that he was doing too much too soon. They warned that he would wreck the ship of state upon the shoals of fiscal irresponsibility. However, Hoover has often been handed down to subsequent generations as a skinflint. However, many of his own generation considered him a profligate spender. In fact, he was neither. He was not lackadaisical like his predecessors, Harding and Coolidge, nor did he place the government in overdrive like Franklin Roosevelt. He did not act rashly, but he did act. In fact, unlike many politicians, he was preeminently a man of action. Many books have been written about what Hoover didn't do or should have done. This one focuses on what he actually did and why he did it. Yet this study is not simply a political history about Hoover's presidency, but rather an examination of his life in its fullness during the years 1928 to 33. Like all of us, Hoover was not an island separated by moats from the larger universe. The nation's leader was not one-dimensional. If he had been a mere technocrat, his philosophies would have been directed, his philanthropies would have been directed at scientific projects rather than those that fed the hungry and empowered the weak. On a personal level, there were few kinder presidents, perhaps none. His friendships, many of which began at Stanford, were lifelong. He bonded with people. It was said that he was a man with enemies, but no ex-friends. As President, Hoover embarked upon a profession that does not reward modesty, but flourishes on boasting and self-aggrandizement, which he shunned, partly because of his Quaker upbringing. Yet Hoover was no loner. He loved human company, and he had a multitude of friends, great and humble, who swept the spectrum of professions. All their lives, the Hoovers invited dinner guests virtually every night. Hoover thrived on good conversation and could be a riveting raconteur. He enjoyed a good laugh, and his own humor was original, not derivative of something he had heard. Beginning in 1914, he collected cartoons and caricatures of himself, many of them scathing, and by the beginning of the White House years, the collection had reached 20,000. He relaxed by chuckling about himself. No modern president, except perhaps Theodore Roosevelt, loved the outdoor life so much as Hoover. His eloquence verged on poetry when he wrote about fishing. Much of his writing was unusually erudite, because Hoover was one of the best-read presidents. He devoured Greek, Roman, British, French, German, and Russian, as well as American literary classics. And his memory for biblical passages instilled in him as a child was precise. He educated himself about philosophy, economics, and American and world history. He also read scientific journals and biographies and was addicted to detective novels. As a young engineer, he read incessantly while traveling by steamer and set aside time for leisure reading every night of his adult life, even during the depths of the Great Depression. Hoover read 4 or 5 newspapers daily, tackling the sports pages first. He avidly followed baseball and college football. He admired people who did a difficult thing well, such as hitting a baseball. It's said sometimes that hitting a baseball is a lot like writing. Both can be done by children. Something that's easy to do, but almost impossible to do well. Though he never took notes, he stored everything he read in the filing cabinets of his prodigious memory. The Quaker president enjoyed a companionate marriage with Lou Henry, a Waterloo, Iowa native, Stanford's first woman geology major, and only the 4th woman in America to earn a BS in engineering and geology. Fluent in 5 foreign languages, including Chinese, she could also read Latin and read many of the European classics in their original tongue. A gifted, versatile writer, Lou, like her husband, personally wrote all of the hundreds of speeches she delivered on behalf of humanitarian causes. But Lou was also a creative writer whose finely crafted essays describing natural beauty are elegant and eloquent. She also wrote scientific essays, poetry, biographical sketches, and joined with her husband to publish a translation of a 16th century classic on mining processes written in corrupted Latin. She was a pioneer in organization of the Girl Scouts and of women's athletics. Lou was her husband's equal in intellect and superior in creative writing, but she lacked his ferocious drive. She was the only woman Hoover ever loved or dated seriously. After her death in 1944, he never actively sought a romantic relationship. There were many sides to Hoover the public rarely glimpsed, such as his gentle humor, his love of children, the intellectual stimulation he derived from convivial conversation, his physical stamina, toughened by outdoor exercise, and his remarkable health. Working 11 and 12-hour days, he never missed a day of work due to illness during his presidency, despite the stress of the Great Depression. Few appreciated the profound nature of his friendship and the breadth of his interests, probably matched by no American since Benjamin Franklin. Despite a busy, active life, Hoover wrote 33 books, excelled only by Theodore Roosevelt's 36. He represents the best example one can find of the type of American individualism he espoused. Devoutly spiritual, though not openly religious, Hoover believed in the divine spark of the Quaker creed, which enables individuals to navigate their life's path, find their own meaning, and pursue their goals without trespassing on the rights of others. His speeches are sprinkled with scriptural references, and virtually every talk includes an appeal to the better side of humanity. If the meek do indeed inherit the earth, Herbert Hoover will be among them. Thank you.